The day Gander arrived at the Canadian Royal Rifles Battalion was unforgettable. The massive Newfoundland dog appeared imposing, with his shiny black coat and deep eyes that seemed to hold more wisdom than one could ever imagine in an animal. The soldiers, initially hesitant, didn't know what to expect from such a large dog. But within days, Gander had won them all over, not only with his commanding presence but also with his gentle and protective nature. Before being recruited into the army, Gander was known as Pal by his family in Newfoundland, Canada. He lived as a beloved pet, but as he grew, his impressive size and boundless energy became more apparent. Knowing the war effort required dogs capable of assisting soldiers, his family made the difficult decision to donate him to the armed forces. In the military, Pal was given a new name, Gander, honoring the brave spirit that seemed to pulse through every movement of the enormous dog. From the beginning, Gander proved to be much more than a mascot. He seemed to understand his new mission. When the soldiers trained, he accompanied them attentively, walking alongside them or sitting guard as if actively participating. During patrols, Gander was always at the front, his ears alert to any strange sounds. He had a sharp sense of smell and an almost instinctive ability to sense danger before the men around him could. More than his physical abilities, it was the emotional connection Gander created with the soldiers that made him special. Amid the horrors of war, he was a comforting presence. Many of the men, far from their families and tormented by constant fear, found solace in Gander. At night, when combat subsided for a few hours, he would walk among the soldiers, letting them pet his head or lie beside him to find a moment of peace. For these men, hardened by war, Gander was a reminder of home, humanity, and something pure in such a brutal environment. But Gander wasn't just a figure of comfort. He was, in fact, an active member of the battalion. On several occasions, he demonstrated his usefulness on the battlefield. He alerted soldiers to sounds and smells that seemed out of place, warning them of possible attacks or traps. On one mission, Gander even managed to scare off enemy soldiers by charging at them with his impressive 40 kilograms, his strength and courage as intimidating as any weapon. Over time, Gander became the heart of the battalion. He was a symbol of strength and unity, and his presence made the men feel as though they were being protected by something greater. They trusted him in a way that defied logic because they knew that, in Gander, they had a companion willing to give everything for them. And as all the soldiers in that unit would soon learn, that trust was not misplaced. Gander wasn't just a battalion companion. He was a hero waiting to show the true extent of his courage. The night was heavy, stifling with the heat of a battle that had been raging for hours. The village of Hong Kong, meant to serve as a strategic position for the Allies, now resembled a labyrinth of destruction. The Canadian soldiers of the Royal Rifles were cornered, holding off the relentless advance of Japanese troops. The narrow streets were filled with debris, and every corner seemed to hide a new threat. The sound of gunfire and explosions echoed constantly, while adrenaline kept the soldiers on high alert. Among them, Gander walked confidently, his imposing figure standing out even in the darkness. He seemed to sense the group's nervousness, alternating between staying close to the most tense soldiers and moving to the front of the line, as if always checking the path ahead. Even amid the chaos, his presence was a beacon of strength, and many of the men cast furtive glances in his direction, as if seeking in him the security that the surrounding scene lacked. Then it happened. In the middle of a brief pause to regroup, one of the soldiers noticed an object flying through the air. It landed on the ground with a metallic, deadly sound, a grenade. Grenade! The desperate shout echoed through the group, cutting through the cacophony of the battlefield. Time seemed to freeze. The soldiers were only a few meters from the explosive, and they all knew there wasn't enough time to run. Any movement could trigger the explosion faster, and even the most experienced among them was paralyzed in the face of imminent death. Panic was visible on the men's faces. Some looked at Gander, but in that moment, no one knew what to do. Gander, however, didn't hesitate. Before anyone could react, the massive dog charged toward the grenade with a speed no one could have expected from an animal of his size. His steps were purposeful, almost impulsive, as he covered the short distance between the platoon and impending death. He reached the small metallic cylinder and, without a second thought, bit down on it firmly, holding it as he had held the toys he used to carry in Newfoundland before the war. The soldiers shouted for him to stop, but Gander had already made his decision. With the grenade clenched between his teeth, He ran in the opposite direction of the group, carrying the danger as far away as possible. For them, it was like watching a hero in action, someone who cared nothing for his own safety but only for the well-being of those he loved. Gander seemed to understand the gravity of what he was doing. He knew it was his duty, his final mission. The following seconds were filled with pure silence, broken only by a deafening explosion. The ground shook, and the light of the blast briefly illuminated the dark sky. The grenade had detonated far enough from the soldiers to spare all their lives, which had been seconds away from being lost. As the dust began to settle, the men stood paralyzed, trying to process what they had just witnessed. The companion who had always stood by their side had just sacrificed everything to protect them. Gander hadn't hesitated for a moment. He acted purely on instinct, driven by loyalty and the unconditional love he felt for his comrades. The silence that followed the explosion wasn't just one of relief but also of profound sorrow. The soldiers knew what they had lost, and the weight of that sacrifice was something they would carry forever. When the explosion shook the ground, the world seemed to stop for an instant. The soldiers watched in complete shock, still processing what had just happened. The deafening sound of the detonation was followed by an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant echoes of combat around them. No one could move. What they had just witnessed seemed unreal, a pure and selfless act of courage that none of them would ever forget. The men began walking toward the site of the explosion, their ears still ringing and their eyes watering from the dust kicked up. The smell of gunpowder burned their nostrils, but for them, nothing was more important than finding out what had happened to Gander. Among the debris and shrapnel, they finally saw him. The massive black dog lay on the ground, motionless. One soldier knelt beside him, gently touching his head. Gander had saved them all. The grenade, which could have decimated the group, had exploded far enough away that no man was injured. But the impact had been fatal for the brave dog. The soldiers, hardened by war, men who had already lost friends and comrades during the conflict, couldn't hold back their tears. They had lost more than an animal in that moment. They had lost a brother. Chris Lewis, one of the soldiers closest to Gander, looked at the dog's body and murmured, he knew. He knew exactly what he was doing. His voice was choked with emotion, and he couldn't say anything more. Gander wasn't just a companion to them. He was the living embodiment of the loyalty and sacrifice that war demanded. And in that instant, everyone there felt the weight of his loss in a way words could never express. Despite the tragedy, Gander's act had given the men something they hadn't felt in a long time: hope. He had shown that even in a desolate place like war, there was still love, there was still courage, there was still something worth fighting for. For many of them, Gander's sacrifice was a reminder of what it truly meant to be alive, to protect those we love, no matter the cost. As the soldiers gathered around Gander's body, they made a silent promise. They swore never to forget that act of heroism, to carry his memory with them for the rest of their lives. Gander might have been gone, but his spirit would live on in each of those men, inspiring them to face whatever came next with the same courage he had shown that day. Gander's sacrifice was more than a heroic act. It was proof that love and loyalty can transcend any boundary, even in the darkest of circumstances. And for the soldiers who survived because of him, life would never be the same. The soldiers, now gathered around Gander, formed a silent circle, their eyes fixed on the still body of the dog who had become the heart of their battalion. The battlefield, once filled with the sounds of gunfire and explosions, seemed momentarily calm, as if the universe itself was paying final tribute to that act of bravery. No one dared to speak loudly. They were all immersed in the gravity of the moment, the shared loss, and the profound meaning of the sacrifice they had just witnessed. Chris Lewis, the soldier who had cared for Gander since the first day he arrived at the battalion, knelt beside the enormous dog. He gently ran his hand over Gander's black fur, now covered in dust and small patches of blood. "You saved us, my friend," he whispered, his voice choked with tears. Despite being surrounded by other men, the moment felt deeply personal. He knew Gander was more than just an animal. He was a hero, a brother in arms who had made the ultimate sacrifice for them. One by one, the soldiers approached Gander to say their goodbyes. Many stroked his head one last time, while others murmured words of gratitude. Some, unable to contain their emotions, simply knelt beside him, letting their tears flow freely. In that moment, the harshness of war gave way to humanity. Even amidst the horror, These men found time to honor the memory of someone who represented the best of them: courage, loyalty, and sacrifice. There was no time for a proper burial. The battle raged on around them, and the soldiers had to continue the fight Gander had helped them win. But they couldn't simply leave their companion behind. They improvised a flag with whatever they had and draped it over Gander's body, as they would for any fallen soldier. It was the least they could do for the one who had given his life to protect theirs. Before they departed, Chris Lewis stood and looked at the other soldiers. He was more than a dog. He was one of us. And we won't forget that. The men nodded, many wiping their tears quickly to focus on the next mission. Even as they moved away, they cast farewell glances toward the spot where Gander had fallen. To them, he would always remain there in spirit, watching over them as he always had. The battlefield had claimed many lives, but that night, the Canadian soldiers felt they had witnessed something far greater than war. Saying goodbye to Gander was more than just a loss. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there is still room for acts of love and sacrifice. The void he left was immense, but the legacy of his sacrifice would give strength to the men who survived because of him. Decades passed since Gander's heroic act, but his name was never forgotten by the men of the Royal Rifles of Canada. To them, the memory of their loyal companion was not just an isolated episode of the war, it was a living reminder of the loyalty and courage they had witnessed on that fateful night in Hong Kong. After the end of World War II, the soldiers who survived the conflict made sure to preserve Gander's story, sharing it with their families, friends, and fellow veterans. He wasn't just a military dog. He was a legend. In the early 2000s, efforts to officially honor Gander gained momentum. Veterans who had served alongside him gathered documents and accounts to present his story to the world. They wanted Gander's sacrifice to be recognized not only by them but by all who understood the cost of war and the value of a life dedicated to service and sacrifice. This led to Gander's nomination for the Dickin Medal, the highest honor awarded to animals for bravery in times of conflict. The Dickin Medal, often called the Victoria Cross for animals, was created to recognize acts of heroism performed by dogs, horses, pigeons, and other animals that played crucial roles during wartime. In 2000, more than 50 years after his heroic death, Gander was finally awarded this medal. The ceremony, held in the United Kingdom, was a deeply emotional event. Elderly Canadian veterans were present to celebrate the memory of their loyal companion. Chris Lewis, one of the few surviving soldiers who had been with Gander in Hong Kong, delivered a speech during the event. His words were filled with emotion. Gander was not just a dog. He was a soldier, a friend, and, for many of us, a savior. He gave us something the war was constantly trying to take away: hope. Today, we honor his memory, but the truth is, he lives in each of us who had the privilege of fighting alongside him. The medal was received by a Canadian representative on behalf of Gander, and in that moment, applause filled the room. Among the audience, many veterans and civilians wept, moved by the story of an animal who, without ever asking for anything in return, gave everything to save those he loved. To them, Gander was the embodiment of selflessness, an eternal example that heroism knows no boundaries, not of species, nor of size. Gander's story was officially incorporated into Canada's military history, and his bravery continues to be taught as part of the legacy of Canadian troops. His name is etched not only in the pages of history but also in the hearts of those who believe that heroes can come in all forms, even in a majestic black Newfoundland dog who gave everything on a cold, chaotic night during the war. Gander's sacrifice was not just an isolated heroic act, it became a timeless symbol of loyalty, courage, and altruism. For the veterans who served alongside him, the memory of the enormous black dog was a constant reminder that even in the midst of war, there was still room for kindness, love, and sacrifice. And for future generations, his story became an inspiration, showing that heroes don't need to wear uniforms or speak commands, they can simply act with their hearts, as Gander did that night in Hong Kong. After his death, Gander's story was shared not only among Canadian veterans but also among historians, animal lovers, and military personnel around the world. Monuments and memorials were created to honor the dogs that served in wars, and Gander's name became one of the most revered. In Newfoundland, his homeland, he is proudly remembered as one of the greatest heroes in its history. To the local residents, Gander is not just a symbol of bravery but also an ambassador of the generous and resilient spirit that defines the community. The Dickin Medal, posthumously awarded to Gander, was not just a recognition of his bravery but also a milestone for military animals. His story helped bring visibility to the essential role played by dogs, horses, and other animals during times of war. Gander was not just a soldier. He was a representative of all the animals who risked their lives to protect humans. The medal helped raise awareness of the importance of caring for these four-legged heroes, even after their service ended. Gander's legacy lives on, not only in history books but in the hearts of all who believe in the power of the bond between humans and animals. He is proof that courage and sacrifice can take many forms, and that true heroism knows no limits. Whether in the halls of military museums, in stories shared by veterans, or in the inspiration he offers to new generations, Gander remains an eternal example that even in the darkest moments, the light of kindness and loyalty can shine brightly.